When I first saw Colby Covington telling his team he had broken his jaw, my first thought was, there's no possible way that this guy actually has a jaw fracture and is going to be able to continue fighting. So say what you want about his personality, but the fact that he was able to continue fighting after we found out he did in fact have a fractured jaw is absolutely amazing. Welcome back everyone to your #1 source for learning about everything related to sports injuries and sports medicine news. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down Colby Covington's jaw fracture that he suffered last night against Kamaru Usman at UFC 245. We'll talk briefly about when this happened and the idea of him having his mouth open versus closed. We'll go over the anatomy of jaw fractures and the specific locations they can occur, and then talk about the treatment of these fractures and how long Covington would be potentially out for. Make sure and go subscribe and turn those notifications on so that you can be up to date as soon as these types of injuries happen around the world of sports, and let's get started. The official report is that Covington was confirmed to have a non-displaced midline mandible fracture. The mandible just means the jawbone, and non-displaced means that the two ends where the fracture was at are not out of alignment. Basically, the bones are still lined up. There's just a fracture going through them. And then midline, which is the front location, if you just kind of put a line down the middle of the jaw right at the chin. Now, this certainly looks to be the punch when this occurred. We can see Covington has his mouth just kind of hanging loose and open, takes a really heavy hit from Usman, and then goes back to his team, and this is when he said that he had broken his jaw. A lot of people, of course, pointed out here the fact that he had his jaw open is potentially part of what caused this fracture to occur. Now, certainly whenever you have your jaw clenched and closed, you're sort of bracing your body for impact, and so your muscles are firing to help provide some protection. But to be totally honest, I couldn't really find much in the medical research talking about incidents of jaw fractures with the mouth open versus with the mouth closed. So this anecdotally makes sense that there could be more risk with your mouth open, but I can't find any real evidence or literature that helps back this up. When looking at the anatomy, we can classify jaw fractures in part based on the specific location of the mandible. The most common fracture location is the mandibular angle, and you can feel this on yourself, kind of right down below your jaw. It's where you sort of get that sharp transition point and that kind of rounded bump. It's most common in part because of the way the forces are different at this location and the thickness of the bone there, but most common location, angle of the jaw. The specific location of Covington's fracture was the midline of the mandible, and so this would be basically the very front, if you were looking straight on at the face, right down in the lower portion in front of the chin. After surgeons make sure the patient's airway is safe, they don't have any major blood vessel or nerve injuries, things like that, the next big step in terms of management of these fractures is what we call the occlusion of the person's mouth. Whenever you bite down, the exact position that your teeth bite down on top of each other is called your occlusion. If someone has malocclusion, that means that their teeth are not properly aligned whenever they bite down. This will make the athlete feel like their teeth are out of alignment, and this is one of the primary things the surgeons are going to look at and analyze when they're trying to repair and fix these fractures. Now, there's certainly unknowns in terms of the full extent of Covington's specific fracture and exactly what the surgeons are going to do, but I want to talk about the two different surgical options here that are often considered when someone has a mandible fracture. In order for bones to properly heal, you need to prevent the two ends of the bone opposite the fracture from moving relative to one another. So whenever you fracture your arm, you might not need surgery, but you're often put in some sort of a cast that prevents the arm from moving and allows those bones to properly heal. The challenge with the jaw is you can't really put a cast on the jaw. We move our jaw constantly for eating, for drinking, for talking, for swallowing, and so it's tricky to fix the jaw so that you don't have movement between those bones, and that's why we revert to these two different types of surgical options. We can break them down into open versus closed. Open is when the surgeons can actually see the fracture on the bone whenever they're repairing it. So they're cutting into the skin, they're cutting through the gums, they're looking at the fracture line on the bone and putting some sort of fixation across the fracture to allow it to heal. Closed fixation is when they basically apply some sort of fixation device outside of the bone without actually visualizing the fracture line. One of the techniques we see commonly used, especially in a more simple fracture, is called MMF, or maxillomandibular fixation. This involves putting a series of plates and screws and wires on the top of the gums, sort of anchored into the bone below, that then allow you to fix the mandible, which is the jaw, to the maxilla, which is the bone kind of in the upper lip and behind the nose. Your maxilla is not moving. It's kind of rigid with your skull, and so what they're trying to do here is anchor the jaw to the maxilla to prevent the jaw from moving. There's variation in the exact techniques, whether they put a plate across there or if they put like a bar and then a bunch of wires, basically wiring the jaw shut. But this is one of the more commonly employed methods, especially when it's a simple fracture and can be tolerated well. Problem with this, of course, is you can't open your jaw, and so there's a risk of having weight loss and having poor dentition and kind of damage to your teeth, because you can't open your mouth while this is healing. People will still get their nutrition just by getting a straw through there and kind of drinking their calories, but you can imagine how bothersome this would be to have your jaw wired shut. Thankfully though, with most mandible fractures, the bone is healed after around 4 to 6 weeks. So these are by no means long-term fixation types of things where someone like Covington is gonna have their jaw wired shut for months on end. This is nothing I would expect to be career ending for someone like Covington, but it's certainly going to be a pretty bothersome month or two here as he recovers from this injury. That's it for the video, everybody. Thank you as always for watching. Let me know any questions or comments you have down below. And until next time, we'll see you later. Bye.